Hey, this is Warren Redlick. I'm here with Will from Boring Revolution, my favorite YouTube channel about the Boring Company. The Boring Company, for those who don't know, is an Elon Musk startup that bores tunnels. So the Boring Company is a play on the name Boring. It's both uninteresting and it's actually quite interesting to Will and I. But also they bore tunnels, which means they drill holes in the ground effectively. So a few things I wanted to talk about. Will and I talk like once in a while about this topic. I'm personally fascinated by the Boring Company. Strange that I'm fascinated by boring things. I find it interesting. Will finds it fascinating. He does a regular. Please check out his channel. I'll put a link in the video description below. So, Will, the thing I wanted to start with is
Yeah.
I posted on X, aka the artist formerly known as Twitter. I posted on September 22nd, which is a while ago now,
Mm.
my anticipation of what the potential is for the Boring Company. And I was surprised to get a reply from Elon saying that what I was saying was technologically possible, but the real hurdle is permitting. So I suggested that Boring Company would IPO by 2028, reach $1 trillion market cap by 2030. And then getting into what I think are the important numbers about what's technologically feasible, I predicted they'll have over 10,000 miles of tunnel by 2030, which would solve traffic problems in many cities and generate insane revenue. And its growth rate would still be rising. And by 2035, they would have over 100,000 miles of tunnel. And by 2040, boring tunnels would connect North America to Asia by the Bering Strait, replacing all cargo shipping and air travel across the Pacific. And then I went into the language from the Boring Company's uh, funding round document where they talked about the future of the tunnel boring machines. That the current one they're working on is designed to do up to a mile a week. And the next one that I think we saw a picture of them testing it, um, was designed to do 7 miles a day. These are like numbers in ideal circumstances and not practical reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
My
I think it's a
experience,
mile per day. Yeah.
even though you and I are both huge fans of the Boring Company, and this is your bailiwick, if that's the right term, this is your area of expertise, you've been pretty cautious about that potential. What I said, what they said in their funding round was, in the short term, if each proof rock 2 mines at 1 mile per week, and they produce one proof rock machine a month, they would be introducing 600 miles a year of capacity. But if you get to the next so 600 miles a year, you do 5 years, you've got 3,000 miles of tunnel. Now that's
Mm.
optimistic.
Mm.
I understand with proof rock 2, but if they get to 7 miles a day potential, and then they only do 1 mile a day, and they produce two proof rock machines a month, I think you really start to get to very large numbers, right? And that's
Yeah.
that's the fantasy. So, uh, so 10,000 miles of tunnel sounds like a lot by 2030, and the real holdup, according to Elon, is really permitting. I think he said it's effectively because of political
Illegal. Yeah.
challenges. What did he say? It's by far the biggest impediment is getting permits. Construction is becoming practically illegal in North America and Europe. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, or later in the interview, in the conversation. But
Mm. Mm.
first, let's start with the technologically feasible part. I've suggested that they could have 10,000 miles of 2030 by 2030. We're in 2023 now. Proof Rock 2 is currently tunneling and theoretically capable of, what was it, a mile a week?
Yeah. So around 230 meters per day is how I like to visualize it, as it were. But
230 meters a day would be about 1.5 kilometers a week, which is about a mile a week.
yeah, around about a mile a week.
And,
Yeah.
and then there's what it's kept capable of, and then what it does practically. Can you explain to the people listening what's the difference between it can do a mile a week,
Mm.
and it's the same thing with like production capacity. So Giga Shanghai has a theoretical production capacity of, I don't know, 1 million vehicles a year, but practically speaking, it really only does 800,000. Because you have downtime, you have other issues. I think your view is that the difference between capacity and reality for tunnel boring machines is greater than the difference between factory capacity and reality.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
explain that?
I don't mean to be a pessimist, but I'm kind of a little bit in between what the Boeing company's saying and what kind of other people think a kind of existing machine. So like an existing TBM, Robbins or something like that. you're looking in the region of 30, maybe 40, 45 meters in a day. So I'm very, very confident the Boeing company can vastly exceed that, uh, even on jobs where you've got poor strata. However, when you start looking at a mile per day, you're really looking at ideal conditions. You're looking at going in a straight line. You're looking at a machine that's basically brand new. You're looking at, you've got a well-trained team on there who have used this machine before. They've got experience, that kind of thing. So that is the absolute perfect case scenario. One thing that concerns me is that maintenance is an absolute monster for tunneling, and you're constantly having to stop to maintain various pieces of equipment, to kind of replace cutter heads and cutter discs and things like that. And because you're constantly losing that time every 2 or 3 days, that eats considerably into that theoretical 1 mile per week.
Right.
So I am ambitious. I want the Boeing companies to do well, but I think it's got to. It's small footsteps. You've got to prove to me that you can do 100 meters. Then you've got to do. There's no. When the Boeing company says proof walk 2 is 1 mile per week, proof walk 3 is 1 mile per day.
7 miles.
That for me, is it 7 miles or I can't?
Anyway,
I digress. I digress. But that for me is a vast jump. So when the Boeing company says that to me, I take that with a small grain of salt, and I say, right, the current machine that we've got operating in Las Vegas is more like proof walk 1.5 in my mind, and there might be proof walk 2, 3, 4, 5 before we get to that, miles and miles per day, and it's a hard one for me to envision, but I don't think it would be horrifically bad if they were doing 300, 400 meters per day. I still think the Boeing company business model works absolutely fine with that. You just have an extra, double the amount of machines that you've got in the ground, and you're still cooking on gas there. So for me, it's not a big deal. Obviously, I want to see the Boeing company vastly outperform what's already on the market. And I think they will. I'm very, very confident in the systems that they're employing and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't mean to dampen people's spirits, as it were. But that's kind of my opinion in a nutshell, is that you are limited by maintenance. Maintenance is what stops you going from 230 meters a day to a mile a day. That, in my opinion, it to overcome the maintenance requires potentially some changes in material science, some kind of new means of kind of reducing wear and tear on the front of that machine, and it'll take some work as well with the back end of the machine, because it's all well and good getting that material out of the tunnel, but then you have a massive heap of material that you then need to move, and then you've got another limitation there. But I'm still very, very bullish on the Boeing company, but I'm just kind of, how do you get from 230 meters per day to a mile per day? For me, is a big jump. Maybe I'll get proven wrong. I'd love to get proven wrong, but that's my opinion on the matter.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is with Tesla and SpaceX and Neuralink, we've had these presentations where they tell us the technology that they're working on and what they're doing to achieve things, and they use those as recruiting events. And the Boring Company had a presentation. I think their last presentation was 4 or 5 years ago. It's been a long time since they did a presentation, and maybe they're just not recruiting that heavily, or it's not that hard for them to recruit for this work. I think when you're trying to recruit neuroscientists and engineers to do the kind of work Neuralink does, it's very competitive. When you're trying to recruit for AI training, AI computing stuff, there's a very competitive market for the most talented people. Maybe in tunnel boring, they don't need as many engineers, and it's not that hard to recruit them because there's not a really competitive market for, I guess it's mechanical engineers primarily who are doing this.
Yeah. If you look on the Boeing Company Twitter page, they've got advertised various roles. It's like electrical engineers, civil engineers, tunnel drivers, that kind of thing, mechanical.
Yeah, the
They're the
point about the tunnel drivers, the one thing I wanted to say when you'd mentioned before we started recording, you and I were talking about this. If you're doing more miles per hour or more miles per day or whatever it is, the it doesn't matter so much if you're hiring even more workers to manage the machines because the value added is so much. If you're boring tunnels faster, then the value added per worker is much higher, right? If
yeah.
you're boring 30 meters a day with one machine and you're boring 230 meters a day with another machine, and you need 3 times as many workers for the 230-meter a day machine, you're still boring more tunnel per your labor than you were before. So I think that's not really
Yeah.
a challenge, but it is. I see your point about maintenance, and it's funny you mentioned material science. It's one of the things that's really special about Elon's companies is
Yes.
come up with um, they seem to come up with material science solutions to problems like, with the 4680 battery cell, they're coming up with material science solutions to how to make batteries better. With Cybertruck, they came up with a different kind of steel. With Space Starship, they came up with a different kind of steel. With how they manufacture engines at SpaceX. And don't forget that the CEO of the Boring Company was a SpaceX engineer who helped SpaceX get going with Falcon 1. He's in the book Liftoff. Steve Davis is described in the
Yeah.
book Liftoff.
The
So
key limiting factor is the cutter disc. Yeah, the cutter disc is the key limiting factor because you might get, depending on the location of that cutter disc on the front of the machine, it wears down to different degrees. So you might get a mile and a half out of it, you might get 2 miles out of it, but if you're doing multiple miles in a week or in a month, you're constantly having to go in there. You're having to shut the machine off. You're having to actually, sometimes you physically go into the excavation chamber. I think you can remove them from the back of the machine, but you're having to remove those cutter discs because, so you've got 22 cutter discs on the front of Proof Rock, yeah, and each one has in and around 8 to 10 tons of pressure per cutter disc. So that's a very key point. So all that pressure is on that thin edge of that disc, and over time, obviously, it breaks down. If you could develop a cutter disc that could do 10 to 15 miles before you have to replace it, or some means of reducing how much wear and tear is occurring, maybe by cooling, maybe by some kind of a slippery coating that you could inject into the excavation chamber. If you could do that, that would maybe take you from the 230 meters per day to miles per day, potentially.
Let's dive into the material science there. What materials are typically used in a cutter head on a tunnel boring machine? Are we talking about steel? Are we talking about diamond? What are they using to cut?
It's tungsten carbide, steel tungsten carbide. So it's a well researched area for various tunneling companies, and a lot of time and effort has gone into developing current tungsten carbide blades. They like to use them at lower pressures, and because that increases the lifespan. But if you really wanted to go hard, because there's the amount of material that you excavate from that face increases dramatically by it's all, I wouldn't say it's exponential, but it's getting there when you increase the amount of pressure.
Yeah.
So if you're going from 5 to 8 to 10 to 12 tons of pressure per cutter disc, that makes an immense amount of improvement in terms of how much you can excavate per day. But the drawback of that is obviously there's more wear and tear.
Right. So isn't I mean, my experience, my sense of Elon, and this is something I've known about him for years, is he tends to go into an industry that really hasn't been innovating aggressively over a period of years, and that opens up opportunity that we can do this 10 times better than they're doing it now. We can do this 100 times better than they're doing it now. And it, like you said, they've been using tungsten carbide cutter heads. How long have they been doing that? Is that like
so they first appeared in the early to late 90s.
So 30 years.
Really, what's changed since then is they've just slightly over time increased the size of the cutter heads. There's not really been any kind of material change.
Right.
So maybe there is something there. It's not an area that I have expertise in, so I can't possibly comment. But that's one of the areas Obviously, logistics are really important for when you're running that TBM, but in terms of actual maintenance, are the key kind of limitation to go after right now, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like another example is for the single piece castings that they use in Tesla Model Y, and I don't know if they're using them yet in Model 3, but that single piece casting that they use, and they're using it in Cybertruck, they came up with a new kind of aluminum. They developed a new kind of aluminum that
Mm.
they could pour into the mold and it would form, and they wouldn't have to do a separate, I don't know if it was a heating or cooling step afterwards, where if they did that with regular aluminum, it would potato chip, it wouldn't hold its shape. So, I think that's my gut hunch is that there's a variety of different technological improvements that they're making, and one of them is they're probably coming up with a better material science approach to the cutter head. And then also, like when you describe the cutter head, I almost think of something with teeth, right? That's digging into the rock. I don't know what.
Yeah, some do.
So, and I,
So it depends on what you're boring through. So if you're going through very kind of soft material like a clay or like a granular type of material, you will actually have teeth. So if you've ever seen pictures of the proof walk that operates in Bastrop, it actually doesn't have any cutter discs. It just has teeth because it's only going underneath the road. So it's only going through that kind of loose material. Whereas if you look at the cutter face for Las Vegas, it's all discs,
okay.
22. And most of them are single discs, but you have some doubles. You do have some teeth actually in the middle of the machine, right at the center,
Okay.
but not too many.
So is there a
But yeah,
technological
that's
is there a potential solution where you basically within the machine you're without that it's designed to replace the cutter head as it goes over time, that is it conceivable they have some sort of thing where they go a certain distance, they stop and they rotate something and a different cutter head face comes forward, and that on the one hand changes the wear and also allows the other cutter head to cool off, or some I'm just saying maybe there's some sort of
yeah,
technological solution they've come up with that allows them to prolong life. And I think you mentioned some sort of cooling solution. Like maybe that we know that
yeah.
they're not afraid to use a lot of water to cool off Starship. Maybe they're jetting water in there, and maybe jetting the water in also helps with the boring.
So they do inject foam into the excavation chamber right at the front there, and they do inject other things as well, bentonite as well, and things like that. Now, if you could inject that at a very low temperature, certainly that would reduce the amount of heat, because when it comes out, that spoil out of the screw conveyor is very hot indeed. You probably couldn't touch it. But if you could develop, because I can't envision you having kind of things on the back of that, on the back of the cutter discs to kind of cool them down. I can imagine that you'd use some kind of fluid. I think that would be the best means of doing that. And if you could considerably reduce the amount of wear and tear, that would certainly help. I don't see current tunneling companies doing that. But another interesting thing you just mentioned is how long does it take to change a cutter disc? Because you're constantly doing it every 2 to 3 days. If you have one cutter disc that's gone blunt, it can massively impact the entire excavation process. So you don't want blunt cutter discs. You want to constantly be refreshing them. If you could have a process where you could take that cutter disc out and replace it within 5 to 10 minutes, that would be a real game changer. The only issue with that is that you've got to remember this is a very confined space.
Right.
You have all your traction motors. You have all your traction motors behind there. You've got things spinning. You've got cables going directly into that cutter face. It's very, very tight. Hence why they have to shut the machine down. They have to remove all that material from the excavation chamber, then take the cutter disc out in some circumstances. So it's a long process. Potentially could be dangerous. If you're removing those and then you have some kind of landslide or something, you've got to be very, very careful. So it comes across to me that the industry hasn't really moved on very much when it comes to replacing and renewing cutter discs. So that again potentially is another area that could be exploited to give you a percentage gain in terms of the amount of time you're not wasting with maintenance, because it is wasted time essentially. if you're losing 4 hours a day doing maintenance, it's something like that. That's a large percentage of a day that you're essentially wasting.
Well, I mean,
So
that's not that bad, really. If you lose
yeah,
4 out of 24 hours, that's not that bad. When you mentioned dangerous, I think one of the ideas with this tunneling is that there's no humans in the tunnel. Is
yeah,
that you're not sending human, like, how are you changing the cutter disc without having humans in the tunnel?
it'd be very hard. You'd have to have some kind of purpose-built machine that would go in there to replace them. But how you would fit that in that confined space
Yeah.
would be quite difficult. If you could have some kind of plug and play solution where you could essentially pull it out and then it kind of you drop a new one in and then you lock it into place, the actual machine does that for you, then that would be a massive improvement over what you, because essentially you've got air tools now and you're removing it and you've got multiple fasteners for each cutter disc, and it takes and if you could reduce that to maybe a single fastener, something like that, that would also make a massive difference. But yeah, it's very, very difficult to overcome the maintenance element when you're spending multiple hours every week replacing things. Yeah,
So
yeah, and that's when things don't go wrong, because we're just talking about maintenance here. If a component then fails, then obviously you've got to go back and change that out. So
right.
you can have additional time that you lose. Yeah.
So putting this in the context of what's happening in Las Vegas right now, the boring company's been boring. They completed the convention center portion of the tunnel, and I'll
Mm.
put up a map of the long-term goal at some point in this conversation. But they've connected to Resorts World. I think they've connected to two other. I watched you just did a video the other day. Um,
Yeah.
they've connected like two other resorts. They're working, I think you said, on right now. Some of the tunnels are one way, one tunnel only connecting them, and they're working on sort of having tunnels back and forth so that you can have, traffic going one way in one tunnel and traffic going the other way in the other tunnel, and that's
Mm.
obviously more efficient. But do you have the impression of how many tunnel boring machines are operating in Las Vegas right now? Are they still on one TBM, or do they have more than one going?
So they have one TBM that they're currently reusing each time they move on to a new tunnel. They have another TBM which is kind of on the side, looks like they're working on that one. And then they have a machine, another TBM, another Prufrock 3, which they've got operating in Bastrop. But they're currently just working on the one machine.
Okay.
So again, that's another limitation. Ideally, in an ideal world, you'd have multiple tunnels all going at the same time. You'd have 5 or 6 TBMs, 5 or 6 different teams, and then you'd throw TBMs at it. And I think Steve Davis has said that in the past, that we're just going to throw TBMs at it and get it done. And that's kind of my would be my approach as well. But in terms of Las Vegas, if you just want a basic kind of update of what's going on there, they've already constructed 3.8 miles of tunnel. They've got links to the Westgate. They've got links to Resorts World. They've got links to Encore Wynn Casino. They have a small kind of node, which they call Riviera Station, although technically it's not really a station. And then you've got the existing Las Vegas Convention Center. So you've got East, West, and Central Station. They've just, at this very moment, are about to connect the second tunnel up to the Westgate. So that means that they can run, obviously, vehicles eastbound and then westbound, which is just a better way of doing it. When they originally started doing all this, they were talking about having single tunnels, and then vehicles will go one way, then they close it off, they go the other. I mean, it's just not a good way of doing it. It looks like the Boeing company has just decided that's not the best way of doing things. But on the back of this, they've also proposed a lot more tunnels and a lot more stations. So 68 stations, 93 miles of tunnel, and that's linking every single major casino that's on the strip, from Caesar's Palace, Mandalay Bay, MGM, the Venetian, all are connected into this one system.
Also the airport and the stadium, and I think
Yes,
the sort of like residential Las Vegas to the north of the strip.
all the major kind of tourist attractions, sporting, the Sphere as well, like you say, the Allegiant Stadium, all these are interconnected, which means it's a great point-to-point system. Doesn't matter where you are, on the Las Vegas Strip or just in Las Vegas, Clark County, wherever you are, you can get into the various resorts there. So it is a very, very comprehensive system that they've proposed. As to what's going to be happening in the next year, we've already got one link going to the Encore Wynn Casino, so we're going to have another link going there, and then we're going to have links going up to the Stratosphere, and then potentially a link going from Central Station up to the Westgate as well.
Right.
And another link to the Riviera. The Riviera's got a very strange kind of setup where it's more like a roundabout where you kind of operate in a loop, as it were. But it's all very safe. There's no traffic lights. There's no kind of gates to enter, as it were. You just kind of operate within that system. Yeah.
Right. So then, when we talk about what they're going to do for the next year, I tend to be optimistic and think at some point they start producing tunnel boring machines one a month. And if they start producing tunnel boring machines one a month that are in theory capable of a mile a week, and then by the end of a year, you have 12 tunnel boring machines. If you put 4 of them in Las Vegas doing a mile a week, then you're going to solve the entire system in less than a year. But, so far it seems like they're not manufacturing tunnel boring machines at one a month yet.
No, so I think they want to perfect the machine before they start what you really should do, because moment, be it a good machine, it's still a bit of a Frankenstein machine in that you've got components from other tunneling providers, tunneling manufacturers, that kind of thing. So when they go to Proof 3, things like the erector and things like the screw conveyor and a couple of other things like the back end of the machine, the pumps, they will all be internal components that the Boeing company will have designed, either manufactured or sent out to another provider to manufacture. So yeah.
Sort of waiting for the Boring company to uncork the bottle and start, if the time comes, they did their funding round, I forget, maybe it's a year ago now. Maybe it's longer. If the time comes when they start pumping out one tunnel boring machine a month, that's in theory capable of a mile a week, that's really starts to be a game changer. And then I wanted to turn to sort of like, what is the business model for the Las Vegas tunnel system that the Boring company is building? Is it they're building it, the county is paying them to build the system, and the county is going to own it, and the Boring company is going to operate it for a while? And how's the revenue split? Do you have any sense of how that's working?
My understanding is that the various casinos are paying for the stations. The Boring company owns the actual tunnels itself.
Oh, okay.
So the tunnels are run and operated by the Boring company. The vast expense, obviously, is the tunnels. Then we have the Boring company app. So you're paying anywhere from $6 to $12 to use that particular system, and it operates a bit like a system. It's a point-to-point system. It can range from one person in the vehicle to 4 people in the vehicle. The plans are for 90,000 passengers per hour, which is a little ambitious, but I'm pretty confident that they will get up to that. And the Boring company will build that system. You'll have the tunnels, and then the stations will be stitched onto those arterial tunnels at the end there. And that essentially is the business model.
So is the idea that the Boring company is funding its own development of the tunnels, and so it owns the tunnels, or is Clark County paying them something to build the system?
As far as I'm aware, it's the Boring company operates and runs the tunnels. I don't know if there's some kind of funding in there from Clark County and the city of Las Vegas, but it appears to be on the back of the Boring company. Right. They operate and run those tunnels.
The reason why I ask this is I see two different models of how this could work, and I like one model a lot better than the other. One model is the Boring company goes to a city and says, we'd like to build this project for you. Here's what we'll charge you. And when we're done, you will own the system. And the alternative approach is, we want to build this system for you. We're not going to charge you a penny. We're going to own it, and we'll cut the vision. What this system I like is the Boring company raises funding, however it raises funding. it does, let's say, 100 miles of tunnel under a city. I'm making up a number, but let's call it 100 miles. And they're able to do
Yes.
the tunnels
Yeah.
at, let's say, $4 million a mile. So it costs $400 million investment to build this tunnel system under Cleveland. I'll make up a city, Cleveland, right? And then they're able to provide transportation to a large number of people for a fairly low price, but it generates a huge volume of revenue because of the volume. And they just tell the city, listen, we're going to build this system for you. It's going to solve your traffic problems, and we'll cut you in on 10% of the revenue. So the city, if I'm a city official and I'm or a local official, I'm looking at this, wait a minute, you're going to solve our traffic problem. You're not going to charge us anything, and when you're done, you're going to cut us in on the revenue. Like, why would a city say no to
Yeah.
that system? And the upside is that $400 million investment is going to pay itself back in maybe 2 or 3 years, if not quicker. Because if you're doing, let's say you said
Exactly.
$6 a passenger, 90,000 passengers an hour. Okay, let's say it's not operating high volume 24 hours a day, but if you do 500,000 passengers a day at $6 a pop, you're doing $3 million a day, right? Times 250 days, you're at $750 million a year in revenue. And once you have the system up and running, your cost structure is really low. Does that make sense?
Exactly, and just think of the cost it would take to move someone, say, 10 miles, for $12. The vast majority of that is pure profit. You've got no driver, you've got a vehicle that's powered with renewable energy.
Yeah.
The vast majority of that is pure profit. And then, like you say, as an incentive, you say to the local authority, here you go, here's 10% of all the revenue. You spend that on whatever you want. Just allow us to run the system and operate it as we want. And there's no disadvantages to that.
Right. So this
The
was
only
my
thing
point.
yeah.
This was my point, is that if you're able to generate, let's say, like I said, let's say it costs you $500 million to build a system, and that system is generating $750 million in revenue a year for 30 years or 50 years. The upside is so huge on this system. And then the cost of running the cost of the ride to the owner of the system, let's say it's a Model Y, and it's not, and it goes 10, you take somebody 10 miles, that's like 3 kilowatt hours of electricity. Even if you're paying, it's like 45 cents in electricity. If your operating cost of the vehicle is 20 cents a mile, you're only talking about $2, but you're getting $12. And of course, over time, they're going to figure out ways of using next generation vehicles that are 10 cents a mile. And then, maybe the road surface inside the tunnel is smoother and you have less wear and tear. The wear and tear on a vehicle in the tunnel system is going to be a lot less than the wear and tear on a system that's operating in snow and ice,
Massively.
potholes.
Massively.
So and then there's basically zero insurance cost, right? So I think you're probably even dropping the cost per mile down below 10 cents. And when you put that together and you say, okay, you probably don't end up charging $12 for a ride once you have no driver. You're probably charging $5 for a ride, but it costs you, 50 cents to transport the person the distance that they're going. The person's thrilled that they only paid $5 for this ride. It gets them there fast. It gets them where they want to go. But then you see, if you enlarge that concept and you say, okay, it's 100 miles in this city, and that's going to generate $750 million a year in revenue. And then you multiply that by, that was 100 miles. To get to 10,000 miles, you need 100 of these systems. Well, now you're talking about 100 times 750 million, which is $75 billion a year in revenue, right? For those systems. Am I wrong?
It's not bad. It's not, and that tunnel stays in the ground there for 150 years.
Yeah.
With very, very little maintenance, and you constantly, like you say, you're running vehicles through that system at a rapid pace. All these people are paying from basically $6 all the way up to $12, depending on how far they're traveling, and the vast majority of that is profit. It's an incredible business model. Business model, and it scales beautifully. That's the most incredible thing. Is the more vehicles you add to the system, the more tunnels you add, the more people realize that getting from east of a city to the west is only going to take me 5 or 6 minutes, and it's going to cost me next to nothing. Suddenly people start traveling a lot more. They're actually, what they would usually spend maybe 40, 50, $60 on transport in a given week, that they might spend more because it's so convenient. But the scalability factor of the Boeing company system is incredible. And it opens up cities as well to kind of expand more outwards and have more kind of satellite cities on the outside there, and then pulling people in. And that could almost continue for hundreds of years. Really, you're constantly pulling people in there. You could have express lanes. You could have like more kind of more like bus lanes, where essentially it goes everywhere, and you could have other lanes which are high speed ones. There's many ways you could pull this out, but it scales so well, and the costs to operate are so low, especially with FSD. And like you say, that the cost per mile is only going down. The cost of electricity in terms of renewable electricity is constantly falling. The weight of vehicles is falling. You're going to end up in a system where basically you never brake. You never need to brake the vehicle. So the wear and tear that you incur on a vehicle, a large proportion of that is stopping and starting. You're going to have low resistance tires. You can have a very smooth concrete road deck that's basically like sailing on the ocean. It's going to be beautifully smooth. This business model expands beautifully wherever you put it. As long as the ground is suitable for tunneling, then you could roll out this system. The consequences of rolling out, say you rolled out another 200 miles in Las Vegas. I think Las Vegas could potentially accept another 200 miles on top of the 90 or so that they've got proposed there. You're killing the bus system. You're killing private cars, because why would you need to own a private car? Right. Why would Uber and Lyft? How would they compete with that? Right. Instantly, they're gone. Every possible public transport system is no longer feasible. You have the whole market under your control, right. And as long as you're not getting out of control with ridiculous prices and you're keeping the local authority happy, how does this business model fail? Because I'm yet to see how it breaks down, because it can't. It can only expand.
Okay, so that takes me where I want to go with how does this business model fail? And what Elon said in response to my post was about the permitting issue. That the biggest impediment is getting permits. Construction is practically illegal in North America and Europe. So there's this larger. I want to tie this to sort of geopolitics for a moment. And I don't know if you're familiar with Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is this big-time investor, future
yes, I am.
thinker, and he's talked about this sort of grand sweep of history. The British Empire was, the dominant force in global geopolitics for however many years, and then America rose, and America replaced Britain as the largest world power. And what we are seeing right now is, from an economic standpoint, it's pretty clear that China is, in Elon's words, China will have an economy 2 or 3 times as large as the United States not too long from now. And I think something like this point, that if North America, with the way Ray Dalio talks about it, the existing empire sort of shoots itself in the foot. Like, they have everything great, but they just keep finding ways of screwing themselves up. And I think this example of it being able to build things in North America and Europe is an example. There's a bunch of other ways. You can talk about, Elon's perspective, which I share, that to some extent our universities have become anti-truth, and there's this dog.
Same here as well.
So there's this, there's this thing in the West where I just think we tend to shoot ourselves in the foot. And it's not just us, it's the Roman Empire shot itself in the foot, the British Empire shot itself in the foot. It's just something that as you become the dominant power, it starts to get too easy, and you start to find you get corruption and other things going on that just sort of undermine your growth. And China's growing faster than we are. China has its own issues. They may be shooting themselves in the foot too, but it's going to take a while for their shots in the foot to hurt. But when you look at this particular issue, if China says, hey, we love this Boring Company idea, we want to build tunnel systems in China, and North America and Europe say, oh, we need permits, we need this, we need that, blah, blah, blah. If you're the Boring Company, you say, well, China wants us to build tunnels and you don't. So they start building tunnels in China, and the end result is it encourages economic growth in China. Like the country that adopts this approach, not only does it make a lot of money for the boring company, right? That's the positive side, is look at how much revenue this generates for the boring company, but look what it does for your city. Look what it does for your country if all of a sudden transportation becomes a lot easier and a lot lower cost and a lot safer. You have fewer car accidents, fewer people burdening the hospital system. You know, people are able to get from point A to point B, and they're more productive because they don't have to drive, so they can, you know, work if they want to while they're in transit, or, you know, they get to where they're going quicker and they're able to get more work done. And having a more efficient transportation system makes your economy more efficient and grow faster. And if
Big
China
time.
adopts this and we don't, then that growth in China's economy happens faster. Does that make sense?
It's interesting. So in terms of China, I think like demographics are not really in their favor, and they might really struggle in 20 years' time. I don't know how that's going to play out. It'd be very fascinating to see. I think the thing with America is obviously you've got massive amounts of immigration, so you've always got that kind of young populace coming through, and you know you could very going up to like 500-600 million, but
Some
we'll
people
see how that plays
some
out.
people some people think that's not a plus for America. I'm ambivalent. I'm pro immigration, but there's a lot of Americans who think that immigration is a bad thing for our future. I don't think China's fertility problem and their population problem is there, but I don't think that's really going to have a big effect in 20 years. I think that big effect is happening in 50 or 60 or 80 years. So,
I think you'll be surprised because there'll be a lot of people who require care, and that'll suck a lot of people out of more kind of creative industries and then kind of engineering and things like that. But to get back to the point, with permits and planning permissions, every country in Europe and North America and even South America and places like that have fallen into this trap of we want to add more things that we need to consider before we give you a permit, before we give you planning approval. So back in the day, if you wanted to build a house, for example, your guy at your local planning office would look at your plans and he'd have an answer for you fairly quickly. Right. Whereas now that one person needs to consider about 10 different factors, whether you're building a reservoir or a power station or whatever you're doing. So the whole planning and permitting process has become so complex and so overburdening. And they're so concerned about making mistakes as well, these planners, that everything takes such a long time. And this has been a problem for the Boring Company for the following reason. When the Boring Company does business in Las Vegas and they make plans and they have proposals and they meet with casinos, these casinos, basically, they want things to happen ASAP. And the local authority in Las Vegas is very, very keen to accommodate that. They want things to go as fast as possible. So when the Boring Company's putting forward, because they're constantly having all these new plans in Las Vegas, it started at 50 miles and it was 70, now it's up to nearly 90. It's very, very easy to get that stuff through in Clark County and in Las Vegas. Whereas if you go to somewhere else, it can take 10 times as long. So it's been both a positive and a negative for the Boring Company, in that it's so easy to do things in Las Vegas. It sucked all the energy out of all the other places, including potentially Florida and Austin, because it's just so easy. Why not just do it there and then prove out the process there? But you're right to be concerned about planning approval and permits and things like that. And Elon Musk can obviously see it firsthand, is that it just kills everything. It makes doing things very, very difficult. If you're trying to fix a problem and then it takes you 8, 9, 10 years to then fix that problem, rather than 2 years in China or India or wherever you're doing things, probably India's even worse actually. But it makes things very, very, very difficult for you. So we've got to move away from that kind of overcomplicating things, to the extent where we build things and then if things are not working out, then we just have to demolish them. That should almost be the go-to approach. In that we've built a lot of tunnels here, we realize they're not working, we'll just fill them in. It's up to you to have put a cost in for you doing that if things don't work out. But you try and do things in California at the moment, it takes you a decade. If not, you just get rejected.
You said you go to the planning.
Same in the UK.
You said you go to the planning office and the guy used to just, get you a decision quickly, and now he's got 10 things to consider. And now that's like nowhere close to the extent of the problem. Now you got to go to 14 different offices, and there's
Yeah,
7
yeah, true.
people. Each office has an average of 7 people who are working on it, and there's like 25 different things that each person's dealing with, and you've got to answer all these questions. But so here's my optimistic
Look at
side.
building regs. Yeah.
Well, so here's my optimistic side. My optimistic side is you get the boring company system up and running in Las Vegas. And let's say you're able to get it up and running in Orlando as well. And I'm mentioning Orlando, Florida, and Las Vegas for a reason. And most
Yeah.
people don't know this, but Orlando, Florida, and Las Vegas, Nevada are the 2 largest convention center cities in the United States. And so lots of conventions happen in these cities. And in particular, lots of conventions that draw government officials, local and state government officials will have, if you're like the Urban Planning Association, the Earning Plan Association will have its annual convention typically in one of those 2 places. And all these urban planners from all these places around the US and maybe even Canada come to this event, and they get drunk and they go to casinos and they flirt with
Yeah.
prostitutes or whatever. But along the way, while they're there, and they go to an occasional seminar, but while
Allegedly.
they're there, they fly into Las Vegas airport, and instead of having to get an Uber or ride a bus or get a taxi, they hop in a boring company system, and it gets them to their hotel quick and cheap. And they're like, wow, that was pretty nice. And then they decide we're going to go to this other casino over here, and they hop in the boring company system and they get there really quick. It's like, this is kind of nice. And my theory on this is, and then they have the same experience in Orlando, right? They fly in for their convention, and then they go to Disney World for one thing, and then they go to Universal Studios for another thing, and they go to this other place, and they appreciate not what it will do for the residents of their community, but selfishly they realize this will make their own lives better in their community. And now you have the local government officials saying, hey, we want this done. And then the boring company comes to the city and says, hey, we want to build this system for you. This is how it's going to work. This is, we're going to pay you, right? When it's done, we're going to pay you 10% of revenue. We're going to build this for you for free. We're going to solve your traffic problems. But here's the deal. You have to give us approval in advance. We understand that there's going to be some hurdles we got to pass, but we need assurances from this city that you are going to apply a different set of rules to our system, because this isn't really, I don't know if you know this, in America, we have all these zoning and planning rules that apply to private businesses that are building something, but those rules often don't apply to government operations. So if government wants to build a building, they don't have to get zoning
really?
for it. Yeah. And so
Fascinating.
I think in California, they still got to pass all these state restrictions. But if you go to a state like Texas, which Texas will probably be friendly to this kind of development as well, the state isn't really getting in the way. It's just the local government. So you basically, the way I picture it is you go to Cleveland and you go to Cincinnati and you make the same proposal. Cleveland and Cincinnati are 2 cities in the state of Ohio, and I just pick on them for no particular reason. So you go to Cleveland, you go to Cincinnati, and you come up with this proposal. And Cleveland says, yeah, we're not comfortable with that. We can't waive all these standards. And, and you sit with them and you say, look, these standards are dumb. We're just building tunnels. This is straightforward. But Cincinnati says yes, and Cleveland says no. And 3 years later, Cincinnati has a fully operating system. And anybody from Cleveland who goes to Cincinnati figures out that Cleveland said no to this, that the governing officials in Cleveland said no to this, and those guys get voted out of office. Like, why don't we have this? Why does Cincinnati have this and we don't? Wait a minute, you stopped this? Like, you guys got in the way of this? I mean, there's this famous moment in New York City, Long Island, where Amazon wanted to create a facility in Long Island, and they were going to employ I hope 25,000 people, making an average of $130,000 a year. And the Democratic Party in New York stopped it, and the jobs ended up going to Virginia. And somehow they don't get voted out when they do stuff like that. So there are cities where the local government officials are not held accountable by their voters. But this is a situation where everyone in the city is going to see the material impact when they visit Cincinnati. And they're going to say, why don't we have this? And once they figure out, because, the guy who's running against the people in office is going to say, hey, I would have let this happen. These guys stopped it. and here's the evidence that these guys got in the way of this proposal. I'm optimistic that we can get past the permitting if you sell it to a city in the way I'm describing, which is we're going to pay to build it. We'll get venture capital financing or whatever we need to fund, or Elon will just pay for it. Who knows? We'll fund the development of the tunnel system, and you'll get 10% of the revenue. I think if I'm running a city, if I'm running a city and I actually care at all, not only about the voters, but about my own transportation, and the planning officials and zoning officials are like, well, this is going to help my commute. If you make it about them, if they appreciate this is going to make their lives better, I think those permits get a lot easier. But it depends on the location.
I agree.
And all you have to do is you demonstrate it in one city like Las Vegas, and you say, this is how we got it done. We need you to do this for us too, in order for us to deliver this benefit to you. Some cities will say, no, that's not the way we do things here. This is a buddy of mine, an old lawyer that I know. We were talking one day about, the Supreme Court says this, right? He says, the highest law in the land is, this is how we do things here, right? The highest law in the land isn't what the Supreme Court said. It's like, well, it's really nice that the Supreme Court said that, but this is how we do things here, right? And so if you have a city that's very bureaucratic, that, this is the way we do things, and this is the way we do things, and, sort of, I don't know if it's Orwell or whatever, this Kafka-esque bureaucratic scenario. And I think you see it, like you mentioned, India is probably worse. It's like, do you care about the people who live in your country, in your city, in your community? But again, if you can make it about the officials themselves and say, we're not just making everyone else's life better, we're going to make your life better. I think some cities will figure out we need to make this work. I think Florida will figure it out.
It's about frustrating that you have a solution to a problem that is scalable. Because once, like you say, once you've rolled this out in Las Vegas and you're constantly, all the time, it's so easy to get new tunnels built. You're constantly adding another 20 miles, 20, 30 miles every year. And it's like, it's growing 150, 200, 250, 300 miles. And it's so easy to get around. And people, and you're essentially eliminating a major social problem, is that people are stuck in their own little areas. They don't have the money really to get out, or they don't have the time because it takes them so long. So you're massively improving the productivity of that city. As soon as that's there and it's visible and people can actually physically see it and use it, like you say, then they come back to their local authority and they say, hey, this is working really well in Las Vegas. Why did you turn that down? Or why did why don't you meet Elon Musk and consider doing this? As soon as you apply that pressure, immediately they're worried about losing their job, because that's all they care about. They want stability. They don't want to lose that job. They don't want to lose that cushy job. So as soon as you apply pressure to them, they immediately say, okay, boom, okay, you can do it. I don't also mind having some kind of like dual kind of level of planning permission, whereby if you're willing to pay additional money towards the planning process, that you get fast tracked. I don't mind having that kind of system either, if that also benefits other people. But what we want is fast, honest, accurate decisions, rather than planning people are so worried about making mistakes that they take so long. That there's so many different processes they need to go through. And it's especially bad when it comes to them approving things that they've never seen before. So when the boring company is building these various small diameter tunnels, they're so paranoid about accidents, about fires, about tunneling underneath buildings, and they become so paranoid about potential mistakes that they don't want to approve it, because why would they take the risk? They want to keep their job. If they make a mistake, they lose the job. So there's got to be some kind of twin system of doing planning, whereby certain people that are providing a service that's like a social good, like a point-to-point mass transit system like the Boring Company, either get fast-tracked or they're able to pay their way to the top of the system. But in general, we need to make permits, planning approval, that sort of thing, a lot simpler. We need to reduce the number of regulations. I'll give you a great example before we go on to our next point. Like, when I went to university, I remember one of our like professors or kind of lecturers showing us some of the original building regulations for the UK from like 1991 or whatever, and the document was a third the thickness of the current regulations, and there were less parts in it. It was like A, B, C, D, all the way up to F, and it just shows you the level of complexity. But yet back then, we were building incredible engineering projects much faster without computers. So how have we got to this process? And the problem is, as soon as you have a failing or you have some kind of issue that you identify, immediately uh, regulators want to include a clause here for this, a clause here for that, a clause here for that, and that problem might only affect 1 in 100 projects.
Right.
So it's got to be simplified. We've got to come to the conclusion that we learn from doing other projects and kind of repeating best practice rather than just trying to over-regulate things, the hell out of things, to the point where people don't even bother trying to get planning approval or don't even bother proposing things because they know it's going to take them 7 or 8 years to get it over the line. It's crackers, really. Yeah.
So one other thing I wanted to mention is, because I think you mentioned Florida. I think Texas is more likely to be freewheeling, except for a city like Austin, which has zoning, because a lot of Texas doesn't have a lot of permitting requirements. The
Okay.
other thing I want to mention is Florida, the state government has a lot of power, and the state government can say, all right, we're adopting this, and we're not going to let the local governments get in the way. So
Yeah.
a really good example of that is Florida in 2019 passed a law signed by Governor DeSantis saying that self-driving cars are legal, robotaxi networks are legal, and local governments are prohibited from regulating or taxing them. So if the state of Florida, for example, said, I met with Elon, we've looked at what they've done in Las Vegas, we see that this is going to be great for Florida. And a really good example would be like Orlando and Tampa have really bad traffic, especially between Orlando and Tampa. There's basically one major highway, Interstate 4, that connects Orlando and Tampa. These are two very large cities, and traffic is just a nightmare. And everybody knows how bad traffic is in Orlando and Tampa. And if you required you to get approval from every city, because there's multiple cities in and around the area, and there's multiple counties in and around the area. If you created all these local layers of government that like everyone's imposing a different regulation and you've got to apply to all these different groups, it's really going to be a pain. And I could see Florida saying, and the same thing in South Florida, from Miami to West Palm Beach. You've got Miami, you've got Fort Lauderdale, you've got West Palm Beach, you've got a whole bunch of cities along the way. You have 3 different counties along the way. You could even conceivably go out to Key West, and that's another county. If the state of Florida said, we see that this is a good thing for the state of Florida to have this system, and we're going to create a separate, looser regulatory system that bypasses local regulation, I think that is something I could see the state of Florida doing. If you have the right, like if my hopes are true, Governor DeSantis won't be available anymore. He'll be, well, I think he's term limited at some point anyway. But someone like DeSantis, who sees this is the path to the future, and like the Miami mayor sees it. The Fort Lauderdale mayor has been pretty good, and he's
Dean Trantalis.
He's a progressive Democrat. I don't think it depends on party ideology. It's like, do you want to get things done that make life better in your community? And Trantalis has been favorable about the Boring Company. So I think that there's a fair likelihood that whoever is the next governor of Florida says, yeah, we get this, we want this, we're going to make this happen. Because there's really bad traffic in Miami, there's really bad traffic in Orlando and Tampa, there's pretty bad traffic in Fort Lauderdale. And you could just make life so much better for the people of Florida. And again, not just for the people of Florida, but for the government officials who get stuck in traffic the same as everybody else. Right. So, all right. So I think we've kind of covered that topic. There's one other thing that I can think of that I wanted to talk about, which was Chap Ambrose.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this guy?
So I'm very familiar with Chap Ambrose.
Okay, so
funnily enough,
just for background for everybody, the Boring Company has operations in Bastrop, Texas, which is just east of Austin, Texas. And I've actually been to the Boring Company property multiple times. There's now a SpaceX facility on the other side of the road from the Boring Company property. And there's this character named Chap Ambrose, who I interviewed on my channel before. And Ambrose he lives next door to the Boring Company property, or essentially next door to the Boring Company property.
Yeah,
And
across the road.
he's like their biggest critic of what they're doing locally. And he claims they're committing all these environmental violations. And as best I can tell, he massively exaggerates their supposed violations. And in particular, he'll say, this is worse than anybody else has ever done. And then in my interview with him, I said, well, can you give me an example of another company that had environmental violations that weren't so bad? He's like, well, I haven't really looked at any. So when you say it's the worst ever, what you're saying is you haven't looked anywhere else, and it's the worst in your experience, which is zero. And I asked him specifically, like,
right,
he's concerned about water quality, because people in Bastrop are living on well water, and he's concerned about water quality. He's like, well, has there been any problems with your water quality? No. And there was another detail where he talked about how there's a neighbor on the other side of the Boring Company property who's a farmer, and he has this retaining pond, and he had some concerns about stormwater runoff. I was like, well, wait a minute. Did that guy get permits for his retaining pond? And he never bothered to look into whether this guy had appropriate approval for this retaining pond he built. Because you can dance these things all the way across the sun. Like,
let me tell you about Chap. Yeah.
Tell me what you know about him.
So first of all, I have an apology for Chap in that myself and Chap actually did a video together, and this was about 2 or 3 months ago. We sat down, we had a nice script, we talked about everything that you've just referred to now. He was a good guy, he was honest, and we talked about various things, including his water. How have you been able to find any issues with your water, that kind of thing. We finished the video. I went off to the shops, I came back, and the video was corrupted. So we wasted 75 minutes of our time. But I learned a lot from that video, and hopefully Chap understands my opinions on things. But the Boring Company has a certain way of doing things in that area, and they like to do things and then get planning permission afterwards. This includes like a new driveway that they wanted, so articulated trucks could get round the back of the site, and they wanted to get going on site, so they had various septic systems that already existed on site, and it's just like, well, let's just use them, before we put a new system in to get going. And unfortunately, these things are environmental, infractions, as it were, but it's not to the extent where you're dumping toxic waste into the Colorado River. But the main issue for the Boring Company is that site is a stiff clay, and whenever it rains, the whole place just gets flooded. It's like a lake, and when you try to manage that stormwater, and when you're trying to manage all the spoil that you've pulled out of those tunnels there, and then you've got cross contamination, and then it's running down the driveway, it's almost an impossible project to kind of manage, unless you have a very specific system to manage that stormwater. And the Boring Company is a startup. It's not going in there to spend $200,000, say, for a dewatering system to remove that surface water. They're just not going to do that. But from Chap Ambrose's point of view, I can kind of understand why he's a little bit concerned about that. And water issues are important, especially if he's getting it from a well. But from my conversations with Chap Ambrose, like you say, these infractions weren't major infractions. They've not caused any ill health. They've not. I asked him if he'd taken sources of water and had them tested and things like that. And as far as I was aware, he hasn't done so. He's not been able to find anything that would cause ill health or damage to his livestock or his water supply. And this issue that he brought up about 2 months ago with the Boring Company installing its own wastewater system, I think was a little bit overblown. Now, as you know, I worked in the water industry in the UK, and I looked at what they're doing there, and it seems perfectly fine to me. It looks like they're treating the water, and then they have kind of like an area, a grassed area where they're kind of spreading that water once they've treated it, and then what they have excess, they're sending out into the Colorado River. So it technically is wastewater, but it's been purified. It's not dangerous.
What I
It's a
heard
fairly
was
common practice.
what I heard was that the treated wastewater that the result of their treatment is water that's cleaner than the water in the Colorado River. So they're actually
Exactly.
they're dumping
Yes.
water into the Colorado River that's cleaner than the water in the Colorado River. And I'm not like, is that an environmental problem if you're dumping clean water into the river? I'm trying to figure this one out.
There are people further up the river that are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So ultimately, it will be cleaner than the water that's in the river, plus all the runoff from the farms, because you'll have all the fertilizer running in. So if I was Chap Ambrose, I would probably be slightly more worried about the fertilizer on the field getting into the stormwater and then running into. But he's got a right to kind of complain about these things, and obviously there are regulations out there that technically the boring company is breaking, but it's not a major infraction that's going to destroy people's livelihoods and going to endanger people. I obviously wish the boring company would take a bit more time to kind of manage things. I don't even think it would be that costly to install like a dewatering system on their site and just drain that site off into the river. If that was in the UK, you just dewater the site and just pour it into a manhole or something like that, or a storm drain. But another thing that kind of makes things difficult is there's not really proper infrastructure around there.
Right.
You've got to source your own water, which to me from the UK it seems a little bit backwards, because it doesn't matter where you go. You could be in the middle of Cumbria, and you could probably find a water main and have your own water. But whereas you've got Texas, and then everyone's got their own wells. It's a strange situation. There's no sewer system. They are building one. They've built this massive new sewage works, but they've yet to connect it up, and it's going to take years. I know Chap was saying that they should pause and wait until this sewer gets all the way to the site there for SpaceX and the Boeing company. Well, I'm not one for believing it's going to take them 2 years, the local government. But yeah, I think Chap's a good guy. I like him. We had a good time during our chat, and I think he's looking out for his family and his neighbours. But like you say, it seems a bit overkill what he was saying to me, and I did watch a bit of your interview last night, so I'm kind of in that same ballpark. The Boeing company can do a bit better here, I think. I think they can change things around slightly, be a bit more proactive in how they manage things. And if they did that,
let me just push back on that. The critical thing that I think is missing there is neither you nor I know how other businesses in Texas operate. And it may be that the boring company does something before it gets a permit, but it may also be that everyone else
they probably do
who does a similar project operates in the same way, and expecting the boring company to perform to a higher standard than everyone else is unreasonable. And my general sense of Texas is that is the way things work in Texas. Texas is, and that I think the general sense in Texas, and not just Texas, is, don't ask for permission, do what you want to do, and then when somebody raises an issue, you deal with it. And I think that's a very Texas way of doing things. And I would almost guarantee you that if Chap Ambrose decided to do something on his own property, he would go ahead and do whatever he wanted, and he wouldn't care whether there was a rule until somebody came along and told him, "Hey, you broke this rule." And that's the way most of us operate most of the time. Have you seen the Elon posted this? I want a permit for a fish. It's a Monty Python bit.
Guy wants to get a license. I've seen it. I didn't. I have watched a bit of Monty Python, but I didn't get the reference. But yeah, I did see it.
The government office. He says he wants a fish license. Just like, we don't have that. Well, I have a license for my dog. I want a license for my fish. He's like, yeah, you don't need a license for your fish. No, I do. I need a license for my fish. And it's this just sort of silly thing. But, if you make everybody who wants to do anything go to the government and check what permits do I need to do this, then you're slowing down growth. And this is the fundamental issue that I confronted Chap with. And there's this, the term NIMBY, not in my backyard?
Oh, we've got a few of them over here.
Right. So not in my backyard. And I don't know if you've ever heard the other ones. There's banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And then there's the extreme version, which is not on planet Earth, right?
Not on planet Earth.
And so, the chap Ambrose approach is, listen, it's great that, there are companies building projects all over the United States, all over Texas, and they're doing all kinds of things that have
Mm.
either, some level of benefit to society, right? And, you see the same thing with Giga Berlin, and you see these local environmental groups, quote, environmental groups funded, which are really funded by the fossil fuel industry and the German auto industry, trying to throw roadblocks into somebody getting something done. And when you have somebody like the Boring Company who's working on a project that is going to make life better globally for
Mm.
billions of people long term,
Yeah.
standing in the way of somebody who's going to make life better for billions of people, I could not get him to process that perspective. And it's like, I mean, I appreciate you saying nice things about him. What I saw was a guy who is so deep into his NIMBY mentality that the Boring Company must be fundamentally evil in order for him to justify. Like I said, well, you can see the benefit here. And he says, yes, I can see the benefit, but I don't trust the Boring Company to do that. Right. And it's like,
Yeah. So he said the same to me. So obviously, I said to him like, look, I've worked in the water industry. I had a look at this, waste treatment plant, this prefabricated one that they're going to install, and there's thousands of these systems across America. There's no issues with it. It's going into the Colorado River. I think I said that. I said it'll be cleaner going into the Colorado River than the actual water in the river. And then his response to that was, well, will it always be like that? Will they maintain it? And I say, well, of course they will. And he's like, well, they've done so much wrong up to this date, then we can't trust them to maintain the. I was like, well, I'm not sure that's how we should operate. But if he could come to me and he could show me water samples that have been, contaminated with various things that have come out of that TBM, there's very, very little things that are going into that excavation chamber anyway. So the very small percentage that is being, washed off by the rain is probably so insignificant that it almost, it almost wouldn't cause any damage whatsoever if there is anything there. So without him providing me with more evidence, then I can't really look at it as an extreme risk. It's when the Boring Company does things without getting planning permission. In my mind, that's a bit like when drivers are speeding. Everyone does it, but in general, it's not causing people issues, is it? Now, occasionally, yeah, people do have accidents, but in general, I mean, it's difficult these days to find anyone that doesn't speed. But it
yeah,
yes, yeah, of course, in my mind, of course, I could look at that project and find 6 different ways to do things, and I'm sure that chap Ambrose would be happy with that. But then my next thought process is, what else would chap Ambrose then find? What else then would he then find that there's happened that would cause him concern? But his water supply has not been poisoned. His neighbours and stakeholders are still operating the same as they were 3 years ago. I'm unaware of any actions or consequences to what's going on. We need to build more things. Inevitably, there are kickbacks from that, but in the long term, when those structures are bedded in, I really don't think there's going to be any long-term issues. So I wish him well, but hopefully he kind of moves on from this this path as well. But the Boring Company technically is breaking some environmental laws, but
right. But I mean,
like you say,
the point here is that
technically,
if our rule of life was that we don't let anybody do anything if they ever annoyed one of their neighbors, because that's basically, because it's not like I said, it's not like he's gone around to all the companies operating in Bastrop, Texas, or all the companies operating in the county and checked on all of them to see what permits, what things they did without getting a proper permit, right? It's
Yeah.
because it's his next door neighbor, he is acutely aware of what they're doing. And he's, again, it's the not in my backyard mentality. Um, that's not a standard that we can operate a society on, and he doesn't,
Yeah.
and, his attitude is, well, they did this. Basically, he feels they're doing this to me, and therefore they can't be trusted. It's like, well, I've got friends who live in the colony who live, 3 miles away, and they're perfectly happy with the boring company's doing, right? But if it and like he could stand out on the roadway with a radar gun and clock all these trucks that are going by at 85 miles an hour, and he could request the state police to come out and start ticketing the drivers, right? And he doesn't do that. And I literally stood on the side of the road. I was taking video of the SpaceX property, the Boring Company property, and I was like, wow, these guys are going fast. And I was driving on the road and noticed how fast, and I'm talking about, big 18-wheel trucks that are heavily loaded, and they're going
Yeah.
crazy fast. And, pretty much anywhere in Texas,
So,
people are driving 50 miles over the limit or 20 miles an hour over the limit wherever you go. I don't know if you know this.
yeah.
The speed limit in some places in Texas is like 80, 85 miles an hour.
80. Yeah.
And
Yeah, I've heard.
if you're driving FSD, which I do in Texas, I did in Texas, the maximum speed on FSD is 85 miles an hour, and the maximum cruise control speed is 90. And you can't go 90
Oh,
miles
really?
an hour on these roads. People will be honking at you because you're going too slow.
Yeah. We have in the UK it's 70, but you're allowed 10%. But there was an accident. I don't know if you know, on that side road that goes alongside chap's property there,
Walker Watson
and
Road?
yeah, I think it was, yeah, Walker Watson, yes, Walker Watson Road. And he was very, very concerned about this accident. And I think a car had hit a truck. And it's like, if this continues, someone's going to die. And I thought to myself, but this is happening everywhere,
Well,
I'm sure there's lots of access roads.
It's not just that, but like I said, I'm standing on the side of the road, and the trucks that are whizzing by are not going to the Boring Company or SpaceX properties. There's a very
No.
high volume of traffic going, and there's many side roads that come into these highways, and there's, when you have intersections and you have trucks going 85 miles an hour and somebody doesn't pay attention, at some point you're going to have a fatal accident, right? And that's the nature, and
That's on the local. That's on the local authority, though. The local authorities, if that road is too narrow and it's considered dangerous, then if they own that road, then it's up to them to, expand it and put, proper speed limits on it and do that sort of thing. It's not on the Boring Company. If it wants to have an access point there, and then people are flying in there and causing accidents, that's on you if you cause that accident. In my opinion, yeah, of course, I'm sure it is a little bit dangerous for him when those vehicles are going past his property. But I'm presuming that they've always gone past that property to cut around various, roads and that. So it's just how it is. Like I can empathise with him, but like you say, I think he's going a little bit too far north for my liking. But
okay, so
he's a decent chap.
We've done enough about, I'm not necessarily going to agree with you, but we've done enough about him. So when you're looking, is there something else you're excited about with the Boring Company that we haven't talked about yet?
So I know that you like the Bering Strait, so because we talk about this quite a lot, but I'm a little surprised because I think there's a slightly better project that's not a million miles from you. How much do you know about connecting South Korea and Japan? Because they have been talking about it for.
I don't know that much about. I mean, I've taken the ferry from Shimonoseki, Japan, to Busan, South Korea, and I've taken what was called the Beetle, which was a hydrofoil from Busan, South Korea, to Fukuoka, Japan. I believe the hydrofoil was about a 90-minute, was about a 3-hour trip. So it seems like that's a very large body of water to cross with a tunnel. You think that that's viable?
So there's 2 islands in between Japan and South Korea. I think it's Tsushima. There's Tsushima called, and they're not a million miles away. Yes, that's the one.
The islands are Tsushima and Iki. I'm looking at it right
now. So I worked it out last night. 108 miles if you go via those islands. But if you had tunnel boring machines on each island, and you were attacking it from either end, that would be quite an interesting project. Because I love the Boeing project. I think it is very, very useful. You can have a hyperloop going through, and then you can have some freight tunnels as well. But you've got to think about the infrastructure at either end. So you'd have to go via Russia, which is not our best of buddy at the moment, and then you'd have to go through the north of China, which is kind of remote, all the way down to sort of Beijing. But I do get excited by those kinds of projects where I can see a real problem. For example, you've got freight ships that are having to be delayed because of bad weather, or they even lose some of the cargo during the extreme weather. And you could have a permanent link that works 365 days of the year, going from say Alaska all the way through Russia down to China. I think that project would pay for itself very, very quickly. Because imagine the amount of freight that's coming from China into the USA is absolutely phenomenal. We're talking multi-billion dollars worth of products. But
let me just lay out what I envision, so people understand it. Is what I envision is a series of a network of 4 tunnels. Could be 5. Let's say 4 for now. 2 tunnels are for cargo, and 2 tunnels are for passenger transport. And they go basically from up from, let's say, Los Angeles, up along the west coast of the United States, through Canada, through Alaska, under the Bering Strait, and there are islands between the Alaska side and the Russia side. So this wouldn't
there are.
it wouldn't be a much more difficult in terms of tunneling distance than the English Channel Tunnel. Maybe a little bit more difficult, but not that much more. And then you have the weather issue.
Probably about the same, yeah.
But somewhere
to the island, yeah.
And then coming down through Russia and through China, coming down to Shanghai, would be about 6,000 miles. And so 4 tunnels would be 24,000 miles of tunnel. And if you were able to do it for, let's say, $4 million a mile, which might be optimistic and it might actually be conservative, but let's call it $4 million a mile, you're basically talking about $100 billion to deliver tunnels. And then the 2 cargo tunnels, which would primarily be bringing cargo from China to the US and bringing empty cargo and containers back to China. But I suppose you could do 1 tunnel and not bother, you could use disposable containers.
I don't know about that. Well, you could ship them over, couldn't you? I suppose you could ship the empty ones,
because they're not valuable. But you could do that, and the volume you could deliver would be more basic. You could deliver as much volume as is currently shipped across the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, so and the speed as well. The speed would be an improvement.
It would be safer. There's all these advantages. There's not weather dependent. But you could literally replace all trans-Pacific cargo shipping with just those 2 tunnels. Really 1 tunnel, but 2 tunnels. And then you think about, like, I just flew not too long ago from New York City to Tokyo. And if you could replace all passenger air travel across the Pacific Ocean, with hyperloop tunnels going, potentially several hundred miles an hour, you would be able to go from Los Angeles to Shanghai in about, I think the number I came up with was between 6 and 10 hours. But there's no turbulence, right?
No.
There's no delays for weather. And the challenge is that there's the engineering challenge, which I think the engineering challenge is actually the easiest part. The hard part which is what you mentioned, is you've got to persuade the government of Russia to go along with it. And by the time you get there, Vladimir Putin is probably no longer in charge, but whoever's in charge could be him or worse, right? But my theory on that is, by the time you get there, China's economy is so much larger than Russia's economy. It's already so much larger than Russia's economy. If China wants this, China just pays off the leadership of Russia. They just say, listen, want this. We'll pay you to let this happen. And it's just enough money that the Russians say, okay, because you could basically, really boost the Russian economy if they just basically charged a toll, a substantial toll for all that traffic coming through. And the value generation for society. I mean, this is one of those things where I'm going to hit like a note that's really important to me, is the course of human history has been old men arguing over who controls a piece of dirt sending young men to die in wars. And it's this perception of the earth as a zero-sum game of who controls this piece of dirt and the resources that are associated with that piece of dirt. And the reality is that if we stopped looking at it as a zero-sum game and we said, if we work together on this piece of dirt, we can actually make life better for basically the entire planet, right? And if we work together and stopped looking down at the dirt and under our feet, we started looking up at the sky and recognized there's an infinite amount of space up there, effectively infinite amount of resources in space. And if we were to stop wasting resources fighting over who controls this piece of dirt and started working together to make life better for everyone and to exploring the universe, we would make a lot more progress for everyone. And really, and just I want to be clear about the benefit of this. It's not just Los Angeles to Shanghai, right? You end up building a network of tunnels across North America, down into South America, across Asia, from Asia into Europe, from the Middle East into Africa, down to South Asia, and you probably would reach something like 80% of the world's population with a tunnel system that would make both cargo transportation and human transportation safer, cheaper, cleaner, and just overall better.
You can't even drive from South America into Central America, can you? There's like an area that's
I think south of Panama.
That'd be an interesting one as well. It makes some sense to do that.
I forget whether I think it's south of Panama, between Panama and Colombia or Venezuela, something like that. But there is this gap of dozens of miles where the Pan American Highway doesn't go, and it doesn't seem like it would be very difficult to tunnel that.
No, it wouldn't
be. It wouldn't be. Tunnel it than to clear the land and pave a road.
I think what the reason that they've kind of not done a traditional road is they were always very concerned about cattle moving up from the south and whether it had foot and mouth disease. And if you could have some kind of system like a tunnel whereby you can screen people before they went in, it was just like standard vehicles. Like even if it's just a toll road, that would work beautifully. But like I said, the possibilities for tunnels are endless. Not just transportation as well. I've talked about alleviating floods and things like that in the past, and using it to move water from areas where it's in abundance to where it's not, and storing it in reservoirs and things like that. And even like pumped hydro and things like that. You'd have a massive reservoir on top of a mountain somewhere, and then you could pump it down.
Have a theory about geothermal energy, that you could use tunnels to generate geothermal energy?
It's very, very difficult to bore tunnels when you go more than about 800-900 meters deep, because it does actually get considerably warmer. Right. So it's one of them. Some people have looked into that, and there is a big project in the south of England where they're doing a large kind of geothermal well. But like you say, the deeper you go, the more difficult it gets to drill. And drilling drilling vertically and drilling like horizontally is like chalk and cheese. It's a
but the point is that you go low enough that it's warmer.
And
you use the warmth to generate electricity. You don't have to go all the way down. You use it to generate electricity, or you use it to generate heat,
and then pump it up.
I think there's a variety of ways of doing that. And then there's the other theory that if you're in a particularly hot place, you might drill a tunnel that's low, that it might be cooler in the ground, 30 10 meters down than it is on the surface, and you might be able to generate cooling from the air below.
It's true. There's many ways to do that. I mean, you can generate heat from like heat pumps and just have like coils of piping in the ground, and you only need to go down about 5 or 6 feet. But there's many things it's as wide as your imagination is, really. You could have compressed air in there and use that as kind of like a battery in a way. And there's you name it. There's different ways of doing things, but moving water is obviously a very interesting topic. There's lots and lots of places that don't have access to fresh water. They've got massive problems growing crops because they just don't have the water to do it. If you could then make water abundant throughout certain places, that would have a massive boost to agriculture. So
I remember
exciting times, exciting times.
you did a video about a particular spot in the UK where there was flooding, and you could do a
Yeah,
utility tunnel
yeah.
from the flooded area to an area downstream where
Shrewsbury. Yeah,
there wouldn't be a problem to discharge the water, and that could like greatly improve life in the place that's flooding without causing harm to the place downstream. You have to be careful when you're putting stuff downstream. Are you affecting the downstream
yeah.
or are you affecting the
The
upstream?
issue there is you have the River Severn, and you have like a large kind of densely populated area that's right alongside the riverbanks, and this place has been flooding for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they're still building right adjacent to the river. So if you could take it further down, and then you have areas where it floods the farmers' fields rather than it floods, 9,000 people's houses, then that would make a really beneficial improvement to people's lives. Funnily enough, I was actually down south yesterday, near Bradford upon Avon, and I was driving across the bridge there, and honestly, the river level was like 20, 25 feet. It was insane. It was like people's houses, like literally 10 inches above the river line. It's a little scary, but it's a fairly common thing that and all that water goes into the sea. It's wasted. So how about pulling it out and storing it somewhere?
Yeah.
We have a problem in the UK where we have years and years where we have excessive amount of water, and then suddenly we have a drought, and everyone's you know shouting about it, saying the world's going to end. It's global warming. We don't have enough water. This is going to happen more and more and more. And then in my mind, I think there's 100 different engineering solutions to stop this thing happening. Why don't we look at that first? Why don't we adapt rather than
No,
go
we
into
need
full on
protests.
panic mode?
We need more. We don't have enough protests. We have a short. The problem with
Yeah.
the problem with climate change is that we don't
Yeah.
solve climate change. We're going to have more protests, and we need to reduce the number of protests. And we need to solve climate change. I actually wanted to ask you. I just had this conversation. I think it was this morning for me, on a space on X, and somebody brought up this question about tunnel boring machines on Mars or on the moon. And
Yeah.
my reaction was that it's not out of the realm of possibility, but in the short run, um, electricity is going to be energy is going to be there's going to be a shortage of energy in early days of the Martian colony, early days of your moon base, and a tunnel boring machine probably uses a lot of electricity, and
Oh, monster amount. Yeah.
the volume of
Monster
electricity you
amount.
need to generate to power your tunnel boring machine, you're not going to have that for at least the first 10 years of having operations on the surface of the moon or the surface of Mars, and maybe even more like 20 years before you're generating. How
Mm.
are you generating electricity to power this thing? Now, I suppose it's possible that, the tunnel boring on the moon, the material's less dense. I'm just making up a theory. Maybe the material's
Mm.
less dense, maybe because there's less gravity, somehow it's easier to move material and you use less electricity. But I still think these things are going to use a crazy amount of electricity. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. You have massive, like a cluster of these traction motors that drive the cutter head. I'm just trying to think how many there are on Proof Rock, but I think there might even be 9, but in it all very closely bunched together, so it's a massive heat source. But that cutter head is a very, very heavy element, so trying to spin that around on Earth is difficult. Whereas on the moon, theoretically, you could be doing 20, 30 RPM rather than the usual 6 RPM, and that would make a tremendous difference. But yeah, you could power it with solar. You might have like some kind of small modular reactor or something like that. That might do it, like actually in the TBM. But yeah, if you were going to tunnel on somewhere like the moon or something like that would be useful. You could live under there, or you could just have like a mining colony. Maybe you extract a load of elements from the moon and then you take it to Earth or Mars or wherever you need them.
Yeah. Well, I think
Might,
once you've extracted resources in space, the most useful place for those resources is going to be in space. Um,
yeah,
you're not going to extract resources from an asteroid in the asteroid belt and bring it back to Earth, you're going to bring it to Mars, or you're going to
Mm.
use it in the asteroid belt. Like the it's called in situ resource utilization for a reason. You want to use the resources where you are.
Yeah,
You want to figure out, because moving it to some other location, and if it's a massive amount of stuff, it ends up adding a lot of cost. And most likely the resources you want are already available on Earth, and it's easier to get them on Earth than it is to get them in space and bring them here. And
true.
probably Mars has a lot of resource. We don't know what mineral resources Mars has, but probably it has a lot of mineral resources. And once you're on the surface of Mars, it's going to make sense to get your resources from the surface of Mars. The moon, I'm less sure about. I don't think, do we know the composition of the moon? I don't know the answer
I
to that.
believe there are metals and things like that on the moon, but like you say, it's all guesswork. There's titanium and things like that. There's some kind of is it helium or something like that that you could use, some kind of specific type of helium that you could use for nuclear energy and things like that. There are things there, like I say.
I think
But yeah,
the thing is with the moon, I'm less concerned about the moon because the moon fundamentally can't maintain an atmosphere. It's a nice place to have a
yeah.
base and have some operations, but that's not the place you're going to build a genuine colony. Mars looks like a
Hmm.
place you could actually build a genuine colony. There is an atmosphere. It's not the sufficient atmosphere, but it may be able to make a better atmosphere, and it does have more gravity and so on. So, um, you think
There's
you
no
think
reason why you couldn't be walking around on Mars with some kind of mask on your face or something like that, rather than an entire spacesuit. You could have, the atmosphere will obviously be still quite thin, but it won't be nowhere near as thin as the moon.
yeah,
So you could essentially have where you'd be wandering around outside, but it's like then radiation comes into it, which is why I did a video in the past where I suggest you live underground.
yeah,
Most of the time, you're protected from the radiation. You can come up to the surface every so often, but you're going to spend the vast majority of your time
yeah. You might spend two
underground.
hours underground and 2 hours on the surface.
Yeah,
Given
that'll be
day.
fine. That'll be fine. You can have light wells and things like that. You can have natural light that's being focused with mirrors and things like that, and sent down to tunnels, and it's all very very doable from an engineering perspective. And that's quite an exciting thing. Is all the kind of inventions that are going to come out of that kind of situation that you're in on the Mars. But yeah, I'm very excited about the future. I'm very excited about the Boeing company. I'm excited about Tesla and SpaceX and artificial intelligence and things like that. Another thing we've not talked about today is could you theoretically end up in a situation where TBMs are driven by a machine and they could analyze that data, because you have sensors all over a TBM. You know the exact amount of pressure that's on each individual cutter disc, the pressure in the excavation chamber, how much material you're moving through your screw conveyor, that kind of thing. And taking all that information as a human and then making a decision with it, it takes time. Whereas you can have some kind of artificial intelligent kind of a machine that operates in its own little. You wouldn't even need a control room, would you? It just kind of operates on its own in its own little space, and it could make those decisions in 1/100th of a second, and it would perfect the art of tunneling, because it'd never make a mistake. It just learn from watching other people tunnel, and
Well,
then on the back of that,
I imagine essentially the tunneling they're doing now is generating a lot of data, and
yes,
they could already start training AI models on the data that they're generating now. But you can picture when they have 10 tunnel boring machines or 20 tunnel boring machines or 100 tunnel boring
mm,
machines, and there's a lot of data being generated. And they have a lot more available compute because in a few years they're going to have a lot more computing power available.
mm,
Um,
mm.
from Tesla's, Project Dojo and so on, that you could see where they would actually, yeah, become a lot better at tunneling because the AI would be running the machine. That's an interesting theory. Like maybe they can
Yeah,
sense, maybe they learn what level of pressure wears out the cutter head faster, and here's how we modulate how we operate the tunnel boring machine to minimize wear on the cutter head.
yeah,
And then
yeah, exactly.
you get an extra 50% lifetime on the cutter head because you're managing it better. I could see a lot of gain like that. Exactly. Yeah. So,
Mm,
so
mm.
anything else you're excited about?
About the Boeing company,
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
or Elon Musk or Tesla,
Yeah.
everything.
whatever's on your mind.
I'm very excited about the Cybertruck. Oh my days! I can't tell you how excited I am to see that vehicle. That's going to be something incredible.
Did you order one?
I not yet. No, not yet. I don't even know if it'd come to the UK. I'd love to hire one for a few weeks and go on a bit of a mission with it. But yeah, I'm just excited about the world at the moment. Everything that Elon Musk seems to touch turns to gold. So I'm
Well,
fascinated by.
there's sort of an interesting perspective there. You and I are Elon Musk fans. We see what he's
Yeah.
doing and we see the really positive things for the future. And somehow there's this massive effort to demonize Elon Musk and make him like this evil monster.
Yes.
And it's really kind of it's puzzling to me a little bit, because that existed before, but it wasn't very effective, and somehow it became more effective. And it's like I feel like people aren't. I'm sorry, I'm going to go off on a tangent here for a second.
No.
It's like Queers for Palestine. Like you're advocating for the side that would kill you over the side that would protect you. I don't like there's this weird thing going on in society where people are just sort of I feel like people have become less conscious, and I don't know if maybe people were always less conscious and I didn't realize it, but it's like people really aren't thinking through the things that they're saying. And it's like, well, you wanted to address climate change, and no one is doing more about climate change than Elon Musk. And you wanted, you want, some of us want to go to space, and our government wants to go to space, and he's delivering broadband connectivity around the world, making a huge difference to millions of people, I think, already. There's so many, and Neuralink is, working on curing brain diseases and solving paralysis and solving blindness. There's all these brilliant things he's working on.
Yeah.
And it's almost like there's this ridiculous mentality. Well, he's just a rich guy and he pays people and they just do things. It's like, well, why didn't all the other rich people do this before? You know,
They couldn't do it. That's why. They couldn't do it.
Because it's
They
not
couldn't. They
just
couldn't manage multiple.
right. It's not just because he's a rich guy. It's because he actually understands how to get things done. And I'm trying to figure out. I mean, he refers to them as like they actually think humans are bad for the planet, and they want extinction.
Extinctionists. Yeah, I've heard that term. I think that's fascinating. It's like people don't act in their own interest. It's so strange to me. It's almost like they don't understand what they want. It's like they're being told that
Right.
this is the way. This is the way. You've got to
population before, right?
Yeah.
And I have this view, which apparently I'm out there on the fringe now for a view that I think was normal for basically all of the existence of life on Earth, which is that the reason that we are here, there's this big question, why are we here? The answer to the question, why are we here, is because every one of our ancestors, going back to single-celled organisms, had children. So the reason we are here is because every one of our ancestors had children. So the reason we are here is that we are supposed to have children. And we've got this perverse world where people think that having children is a bad thing. And like me at 57 wanting to have children makes me a pervert instead of this is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to have children. We're supposed to raise children. This is how humanity grows and advances and makes life. And this is, you don't, people say, well, the Earth would be fine with, 1 billion people instead of 8 billion people. Like 1/8 the people means 1/8 the Einsteins. It's 1/8 the Elon Musk. It's 1/8 the, choose your great person. Choose the person who's doing something you think is really valuable. You're going to have fewer of those people. The more people we have, the more creative people we have, the more accomplished people we have, the better things get. And there's this mentality that's completely wrong that having more people is bad for the planet, when we're a fly on an elephant's ass. We're tiny compared to the Earth. People have no sense of the scale of the planet, the scale of the universe. We're like a speck, and somehow they think we're destroying the planet. The planet doesn't barely notices we're here.
People have no idea about time and scale either. They couldn't tell you how many, how big the sun is compared to the Earth. They couldn't tell you how old the Earth is. You know, these kind of basic, you know,
Yeah.
tidbits of information. It kind of blows my mind. But yeah, these are so exciting times. You know, Starship. You know, it's incredible.
Yeah. So tell me
But
some.
oh, another thing I wanted to talk about
Go ahead.
was Boeing Company IPO. This
Yes.
is one of these things that I've talked about in the past, but I'm unsure. I'm unsure if it'll ever happen because I want it to happen, but it's not that it's impossible that it could happen. I just think that all the pressure that there's constantly put on Elon Musk is kind of turned him off to the idea of listing his companies, and I think that if there hadn't already been all this massive pressure on Elon Musk, he would have already IPO'd Starlink. In my opinion, I think he would have already done it because I think the business is out there now and it is kind
Yeah.
of proving itself. And I think that in his mind, he would have IPO'd that by now. Maybe not because of the economy. The economy's not great, but I think he would have done it by now if it wasn't for all these external pressures. Um, I think it's easy for him for a company to remain private, in my opinion. And it's a sad situation that because these are all companies that I'd like to know more about. I'd like to invest in, and I'd like other people to get to know and invest in. And those opportunities that we all got from investing in Tesla, you know, many years ago, might not be available to other, you know, the younger generation with Starlink or the Boeing Company
Well,
or
so here's what I
Neuralink.
see with the IPOs. First of all, I think Starlink will IPO possibly next year because they're
Yeah.
now, I think, cash flow
How?
positive. They're now cash flow positive, and they will probably be, clearly profitable. And you don't want to IPO early because I have my startup idea for the pod car, which is behind me, this vision for the pod car.
All
You
right.
don't want to start up when you're not profitable because you get less investment and you have to give up more of your company. If you wait
Right.
until your company is successful, then you get a larger investment for a smaller share of your company. So with the Boring Company, I mentioned sort of a business model idea before, and I could actually see the Boring Company taking the approach of each system it builds in each city ends up being a separate company. And
Yes.
they do a funding round with venture capitalists or investors who provide,
Mm.
let's say $100 million or whatever it takes. Let's say it's 100 miles of tunnel, so it's $400 million. He raised $400 million to build this system, and Elon
Mm.
chips in more 51%, so he controls it, right? Or 60%, so he
Yeah.
controls it, something like. Or the Boring Company chips in 60%. Elon controls the Boring Company. The Boring Company controls it, but you have these other investors. And if each one's a separate company and one of them blows up, right? One of them has some massive liability problem. Your liability is limited to that one system rather than
Mm.
the whole system. And then from an investor's perspective, if I buy into the Boring Company and the Boring Company ends up being a money printing machine, I don't need the liquidity of an IPO. I just
Yeah.
I just like to cash my checks, and you create some level of liquidity that you can sell your ownership to someone else. But there may
Yeah.
not be a huge value in going completely public. The investors might say, "Well, I was looking for a liquidity event, but if you're just going to be handing me checks every year, and then those checks are going to grow as the system grows, like I don't need an IPO. I'll just take the money and print the money and take the money." So I do think there is a potential that the Boring Company doesn't bother doing an IPO. That that
Yeah.
that the investors might say,
Be a
"How am I
real
getting
shame.
these big fat checks every year? Then I don't need an IPO." And you create
Mm.
some
Mm.
level of liquidity of letting people sell stock. I'm not sure exactly how you would pull that off, but I think there's ways of pulling that off. With Starlink, I think they've committed to doing an IPO, and I think they will do an IPO. And then the other issue is, like
Yeah.
with the Mars mission, I don't think SpaceX will ever be IPO'd. SpaceX, the company as a whole, because once you're publicly traded, you're going to get the Gary Blacks of the world saying, you don't need to worry about Mars. You need to worry about launching satellites. You get all these investors worried about the quarterly revenue numbers instead of the long-term mission. And so Mars
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
mission,
It's
Mars is a mission that really requires, not being a public company, in my opinion. where Starlink,
No.
once it's up and running, it's not like Starlink has some crazy mission to like accelerate the transition to sustainable energy or build a colony on Mars. It's just a money printing machine. And, you know, you IPO it and SpaceX retains, 60% ownership in Starlink. It IPOs and offers, it might actually offer a lot less than that, but let's say it offers 40% ownership in the company, generates a huge amount of cash that they can use to fund that SpaceX can use, right, to fund the Mars missions. And there's an ongoing stream of revenue from Starlink generating more cash. I think that's a model that makes sense, but there's nothing special about, to my mind, there's nothing special about the Boring Company that would say, okay, let's not bother doing this bearing project, because you'll be able to see, when you decide to invest and it's like $100 billion, you get investors to do the boring bearing project, and the Chinese chip in 30%, and whoever you raise that money. I don't think the public company status is going to impede these projects being built.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
And it's also like, it's not that the Boring Company has some larger mission like get us to Mars or stop, climate change. It's just, let's make transportation better. But I could see them saying, again, we don't need to IPO the Boring Company because we just don't need to. I think
there's different ways of looking at it.
The other one that won't IPO for a long time, if ever, is XAI. Like Twitter, X. Actually, I kind of think X, formerly known as Twitter, probably will not IPO for a long time, because once you IPO, you lose control over free speech.
Yeah.
And with XAI, I don't think Elon wants to lose control over artificial general intelligence. So
no.
Now you could IPO, and Elon, if Elon effectively has, let's say, majority ownership of X, but it IPOs and 30% of the company is publicly traded or 40% is publicly traded, then he has less to worry about. If XAI goes IPOs, and like I said, as long as Elon owns a majority share in the company, maybe he's less worried about that problem. Does that make sense? Like, so even if you IPO SpaceX, if Elon has a majority stake in ownership in SpaceX, and some, other investors say, hey, we don't want you to go to Mars anymore, Elon says, hey, this is the mission of the company. We've told you this is what we're going to do. If you don't want to be in this, sell your stock and somebody else will buy it.
He could structure it in a way whereby his salary is essentially just all shares. So he's getting X number of shares every year, or percentage of the company, and his stake is always increasing, or is kind of matching what new investors are coming in. Couldn't you? So that's interesting. What about Neuralink? Do you think that is possible in the next 5 years or so, or
an IPO?
Yeah, no, or a bit more than that.
I think he's going to wait until Neuralink is at some level of scale and generating profit. And so I think that it's going to be, first human patient will probably be 2024. And by the end of 2025, we'll probably have several human patients. And they are working on being able to ramp up to do this at scale. But I think given the regulatory structure, I actually think this is something where, development might go faster in China because there's less impediments.
I'm surprised that some tiny country somewhere.
No, I'm surprised. No, I would think China. I'm surprised that Elon hasn't gone to China and said, hey, we think we could accelerate this development a lot faster if we did, identify the country that's maybe South Korea. I think South Korea is pretty positive for this kind of stuff. Identify a country that's more friendly to this kind of development. And I think the problem is that the engineers who are working for Neuralink are Americans and want to be in America. And so the idea of doing this in another country is a little challenging. But I think that it's going to take minimum of 5 years to get to the point where you've done enough work to start scaling, and then it's going to take another 3 or 4 years to scale to some reasonable level. So I think a Neuralink IPO is probably 6 to 10 years away. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's good. It's good to think about things like this. Because one day we might have to get our Tesla and switch it over to something else, and that'll be a tough
Well,
old decision
if I'm
to do
correct in
a
Tesla,
swap.
if I'm correct in Tesla, let's say 5x is in the next, 4 or 5 years, and then there's an
Mm,
IPO of, Starlink. Starlink will already have IPO'd. Once it's an IPO, it's easy to invest in. But if, let's say, 4 or 5 years from now, Tesla has, 5x, then I already have a substantial amount of, stock. So, all of a sudden I've got some free cash. And one of the challenges when you're investing in a company that's not public, you pretty much have to make like $100,000 minimum investment and sometimes more than that. So if I had, the opportunity to put $100,000 into the Boring Company today, I would, because I see the Boring
oh
Company
yeah.
reaching this ridiculous valuation. We're talking about a 100x or a 200x from where it is now. So I would love to get in on that. But when you invest in that type of investment, your investment is not liquid. You can't sell it tomorrow. So there's all kinds of issues.
No, it's a risk reward, isn't it? If you're willing to park that capital for 5 or 6 years, then
Yeah.
it's worth it, isn't it? Or longer.
All right,
Great
listen,
stuff.
we've gone 2 hours. I think we should probably wrap this up. Anything else on your mind before
I
we
agree.
wrap up?
No, I'm all good, mate. Hope you got enough content. Good stuff.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you so much for doing this with me, and thank you for what you're doing. Letting people know more about the Boring Company. If you're still watching this, please check out Will's channel, Boring Revolution, on YouTube. Have you? Oh, actually, one quick question: have you thought about publishing your videos on X as well?
I do. I drop them on X and YouTube at the same time. So yeah, if you like watching it without the adverts, then watch it on X, which is my preferred way of doing things. Definitely do so. Definitely do so. And if anyone ever has any questions about anything or things like that, reach out to me on X. I'm more than happy to provide answers and things like that. I do enjoy talking to people.
At Boring Revolution, right?
That's the one. That's the one.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Will.
Take care. Thank you, my friend.